Hello, my name's Georgie Wemyss, and I'm going to be hosting this event this evening. So thank you very much, Ahmadullah. Thank you very much, Brick Lane Circle, for facilitating this discussion that we're going to open out to after Shabna's been talking about her book, which is scattered around the room in various places from Sylhet to Spitalfields. After we finish, it is going to be on sale at a cut price, and I think you might be around to sign some copies as well, mightn't you?
I've been practicing.
Yeah, you've been practicing. Okay, so welcome everybody. This book, which I'm just going to say why it's so important to me. I wasn't in East London in the 1970s. I didn't move here until the 1980s. But when I did move here, like Ahmadullah, I really knew very little, and I began to hear little kind of see little glimpses of what had been happening in the 1970s. But it was really a very, very hidden history, even when it was relatively recent. And it was such a joy to read Shabna's book. First of all, to find out that you were writing this book. But afterwards, when you asked me if I would do a pre-read, which I brought along this well-thumbed copy, because what it did for me was it really situated the whole struggle for housing, the Bengali struggle for housing, and the movement of the Bengal squatters, not just as something which was very local and which was of course part of the anti-racist activities of the time, but also really bringing in all of those empire, colonial, much wider migration contexts that really seem to be written out of how very many local events, especially even those that involve the British Bangladeshi community, have been written out. So it had a really big impact on me. So thank you very much. So what we're going to do this evening is I've got a few key questions that I hope are questions that might be shared by people in the audience. I'm going to ask you, Shabna, to answer them, and we might discuss them a little bit more. And then we'll open the discussion to people here, and I know there's many people here who were themselves involved in some of the events in the 1970s, whether in the particular place that Shabna's written about or elsewhere. So we're really looking forward to you being part of the discussion as well. And then we'll break up, and there'll be time for book signing and everything. But before that, of course, I want to just have a little pause for reflection about another event which I think many of us know is happening now, which is the silent Grenfell Walk. As today is the 6th anniversary of the Grenfell fire, and I think many of us, if we weren't here this evening, we would be joining and showing solidarity to our friends who are also on that walk. So we don't want to forget, and of course we know that there is a relationship between what we're going to be talking about this evening and what happened in 2017. And also, of course, the recent Shadwell fire, where Mr. Mizanur Rahman lost his life very recently in March, and so we also remembering him and the others who suffered so much on that night, very, very close to here. So having said that, Shabna, the first question that I would have if I was coming here and knew absolutely nothing about you would be, what is your route to the book?
Yeah, thanks, Georgie. That was a really nice introduction, but also I'm really glad that you kind of noted the anniversary event that is today. And before I do answer your question, I do have to thank the people in this room. A, you're here on such a hot evening, that's kind of a lot of gratitude for that. But also there are so many people in this room who contributed through their stories to that book. So it's my name on the cover, but it is actually a shared story and a shared effort, and none of what I've written or what I'm speaking about today would have been possible without all those people kind of sharing their stories and, going through some really quite painful things and memories for themselves in order to have this history recorded. So I think I just wanted to note that to start off with. And I guess kind of coming back to your question, and I think lots of people actually, when they first arrived in this room, said to me straight away, it was like, oh, well, what prompted you to write it? And it starts with my parents. My dad is sitting here, and my mum has obviously been in the country for too long because it was apparently too hot for her to come out today. But it starts with my parents, and my mum and dad were in Tower Hamlets in the 1970s, and my dad had been here for a while beforehand. And by the mid-1970s, my dad, who'd been here alone, like lots of other men who arrived from Sylhet in Bangladesh, decided by the 1970s that they were going to bring their families over. And so my mum came over, and my big sister, who's somewhere in the room and running around doing all the chores of any event, because it doesn't kind of matter whether it's a family event or a professional event, my sister is always the one who's running around doing stuff. But my mum and my sister arrived, and I was born shortly afterwards, and there was a housing crisis in Tower Hamlets because people like my dad and many other families couldn't find anywhere to live. And it was a story that my parents shared with me initially when I was much younger, and I kind of heard it, but I didn't listen. And I think we often do that. We often kind of have quite superficial kind of conversations with people, and it was only when I began to reflect as an adult, and as when I became a mum myself actually, that I began to kind of think about what my parents had shared with me in terms of their migration history, their early experiences of when they were parents and trying to kind of raise a family. When I was born in Tower Hamlets at the time, and so I guess the story really started with my parents. It started with them sharing their stories and me recognising that actually there was a really important story that was there in their personal history. And going to do some of the research, I remember very early on meeting you, Georgie, because I became more interested in, well, what's this history? And going on one of your walks with Ihsan when he was very small. But then realising there was a real gap in that history, and that actually what my dad had told me and what my mum had told me, none of that seemed to be recorded anywhere. There were kind of snatches of it in kind of some archival places. There were mentions of it in other squatter histories. But the Bengali story was very much kind of marginalised. And so then I decided that I wanted to do something about that and make sure that actually that history didn't disappear with that generation. And sadly, lots of that generation have passed away, even in the time that it's taken me to do this work. So it was very much a journey from a personal perspective. I don't think I kind of knew that I wanted to record it in some way, and that the book was the best way to do it. But when I started out, I didn't imagine that it was going to end up there. I hoped it would, and I'm glad it did.
So it's amazing. I can just imagine, with children as a mum, you're working full time as a teacher as well. What were you teaching?
I taught politics.
Politics, right? Very appropriate. So you were doing all that, and then you decided that you would do a PhD.
Yeah.
So you started off doing a PhD on the subject, and then you had to do all of that research, and then you had to do that in a particular academic way, and then you had to think about how you were going to make that into an interesting book which would be accessible and interesting to the people who it concerns the most. So what was really important to you in rewriting the book, the PhD, into the book that we've got here?
That's a really good question, but before I answer that bit of the question, I guess I should say that I never thought I was going to do a PhD. I was never the kind of person that thought, I want to do a PhD, that I saw myself in kind of academia and doing that kind of thing. It never occurred to me. I did my master's in my 20s, I'm in my 40s now, and it just hadn't been an aspiration. But it was, and this is something for us to all consider perhaps in the discussion afterwards, because it was that I couldn't find any way to do this research in a way that could kind of that I had the legitimacy to be able to go out and ask the questions, to get to interview people, to be in spaces where I could do those interviews. So it was, so I never intended to do it as a PhD. I wanted to do a community history project, but just didn't have the resources or the avenues or networks to do it. And so the PhD became the easiest route, which wasn't easy, because doing a PhD isn't easy. But yeah, so the PhD became the easiest route, and luckily the applications that I put in, Queen Mary were really supportive. They provided a scholarship for me to be able to do it, and the funding. But I never intended to do the PhD. It's a great thing to do, but it's not something that I like I enjoy the experience, but it's not academia and academic life, and the way you have to write for the academic world is very different to how I am and how I want to communicate with people. And so having done the PhD and having had to write in a way that was really artificial for me, because the PhD is very much, it does a great job. It kind of thinks about it in a really theoretical way and thinks about the big ideas. And I like big ideas, but I like tangible, real stuff as well. And so the PhD was based on oral history. And I interviewed lots of people in this room, actually. And so that was the heart of the PhD, but I had to write it in a very different way for the academic space. And so the book, turning it into a book, was about undoing all of that and unpicking all of that and going back to what I really enjoyed about it, which was the people and the people's stories and what they told me, and being able to kind of translate that into a way that kept some of that theory, because I think the theory is important. It tells us about kind of empire. We see those long kind of links between what's happened before and the present, and then the 70s, which I kind of focus on. So kind of translating it from the PhD to this book felt like a nice experience for me, because it was more in line with how I wanted to write, and also allowed me to centre the voices of participants, because academic writing likes a lot of theory, a lot of discussion, and I like the people, and the people come across in this book more.
Definitely. Are there people here who've already read the book? Can you just put up your hand if you have already read the book? Yeah, so there's a few people who will definitely have heard those very strong voices coming through from those oral histories. So some of the things that one of the things that I noticed reading the book, and I didn't see the PhD, was how you put yourself into it as well, because each of the chapters starts with a little story, a little vignette from your own experience. So I don't know if that was in the PhD or not, but I think it worked really well in the book. And could you say a little bit about why you did that and what it does for each chapter?
Yeah, I couldn't separate myself from the book, because it is part of my story, it's part of my family's story, it's going to be part of my children's story, and my nephew and everyone, it's part of our shared story. And so I think, again, the way that academia sometimes, and my supervisors were very generous and leaned into how I wanted to write it, but academia sometimes wants you to divorce yourself and kind of this idea of an objective truth, and you've got to kind of depersonalize what you write about. But I always find that difficult. Whether it's my teaching or my new job, whatever it is, I think it's really important to put yourself in there. And so I don't do it in this kind of, I hope not an ego way. What I want to do is to show how the things that I talk about in that kind of historical way relate to different points of our lives, and that we can relate to some of these big histories by kind of attaching them to little different parts of our lives. And so I track the different chapters of the book by kind of relating it to something of how it kind of relates to a personal experience for me. But I hope, and what has been nice is that since having published the book, there's lots of people who've come to me and said, oh, I really like this about this, or this was interesting. And so that's exactly what I mean, is that, people can see or hear different parts of the book and how it relates to them and their experiences. And I guess that's what I value from when I read stuff. I remember your book, I've said this to you several times. As soon as I read your book, I went to before I read the book, I went to the acknowledgements, because I wanted to know about you. I wanted to know about who you were and who was important to you, so I could know who was writing this book. And I've always enjoyed that. When I kind of read stuff, I want to know about who is doing the writing.
Yeah, me too. I'm going to get you to kind of focus in on some little areas of the book with the next few questions that I'm going to ask. But one of the things that I really came across so strongly, and I expect this is with other people who've read the book as well, is how your work challenges these very simplistic writings that we see in the media, in the political arena, even in, I don't know, textbooks that we read as well, that just give such a one-dimensional understanding of the British Bangladeshi community, and maybe ignores so many of the many differences within a very, very complex community in a complex political arena as well. And it was so good to see the nuance that is carried through in every chapter, because of the fact that you have these oral histories, and because of the fact that the voices of the women who've been ignored in so many other texts, and the men from so many different Bangladeshi experiences come together, and the differences that they have, as well as the similarities and the shared struggle, really comes across and challenges that simplistic kind of idea which has become so dominant. So I just wondered if you would like to sort of focus on particular parts of the book where you feel these simplistic notions have really been challenged in your work.
Yeah, I really wanted to do that, Georgie, so I'm glad that that's how you feel about it, because I think that one of the things about us is where we do get written about as a Bengali community, we're written about in this really kind of big, flabby way that we're all kind of the same, and we're not kind of given any nuance. We're not even allowed, we're not allowed to disagree with each other. There's no kind of imagination to how we've previously been written about. And I think that what I really wanted to capture was the diversity. We are such a diverse, community. We are not homogenous. We have lots of different competing, sometimes quite conflicting views, and that's part of who any community, right? And I think that the way we've been written about previously, whether it's by kind of non-Bengali researchers or even Bangladeshi researchers but not Sylheti researchers, is often doesn't give us the liberty to be all the diverse community that we are. And so I really wanted to ensure that I didn't try and to kind of tidy things up and make it all neat and nice for everyone, and that everyone was agreeing that this is exactly how it happened and we all felt this. It wasn't like that. The oral history showed that people, and it's the nature of history that different people have different accounts and different memories, and also kind of prioritise some things rather than others. And I wanted to reflect that. I think there's a bit of an instinct when you're doing that, and when you're trying to create a narrative and a thread, that you just want to tidy it up a little bit. Oh no, that doesn't agree with the line that I'm trying to kind of present. And there's a temptation to want to tidy things up. But I think that I was always reminded about why I was doing this in the first place, and that actually, as someone from a Sylheti background, it was really important to capture the diversity of our community. Also, we are a working class community. Lots of us have progressed, and social mobility has enabled us to kind of enjoy a middle class lifestyle. But even within kind of the migrant community here now, that profile is also really diverse, and I wanted to capture that, particularly in the last chapter, because I think the last chapter also told us about the very divergent views about what's happening now. And again, there are often attempts to try and imagine, pretend, I don't know, that everyone thinks the same thing. We don't. And just coming back to the women's thing, I think that the way that the Bengali squatters' history has been traditionally marginalised anyway was that the Bengali squatter experience was all to do with, it was to do with kind of deprivation, and they had nowhere else to go, and so they squatted. End of. That made it uninteresting. And for me, that was entirely why it was interesting. We experienced state racism, we experienced street racism, you had the rise of the National Front, threatening the community, and it was all of those factors that meant that this community was suffering housing discrimination at the time. And they decided, and this is a migrant group who didn't have huge educational capital, were just finding their feet. And they stood up to that, and they kind of took direct action, because actually relying on the state to provide them the resources wasn't working. Relying on the police to protect them wasn't working. So you had families, individuals, mums who took this situation into their own hands. And there were lots of different experiences of that kind of squatting history. And so not only did you have the marginalisation of that squatter history, but you have the double marginalisation of women's voices, which was that the idea that it was just all about the men. And of course it was about the men. The men were very much a part of the vigilante groups, and often that very overt kind of visible reaction to the National Front. But it was the women who were making the homes, and who were the guardians of those squats, and who encountered the kind of council officers who were coming along to the door, or the police who would turn up at the door. You know, the women were part of that movement in very different ways, and so it was really important to capture women's experiences and all the different divergent voices about how people felt about that time. And yeah, so I'm glad it comes across.
I mean, one of the things that really struck me was one of the people that you interviewed was talking about how dangerous it was to get to the public baths. I don't know if you.
Well, yeah. So that's an interesting. That's how like the material kind of conditions of the home impacted on your experience of the outside world. So lots of the flats and houses that people took didn't have bathrooms. You know, they might have had an outside toilet, but they didn't have a bathroom and bathing facilities. So lots of the menfolk in particular would go to the public baths. And like, for example, I walked past Cheshire Baths on Cheshire Street, and that was a no-go area for Bengalis. That part of the of kind of Brick Lane going into Shoreditch was a no-go area. And so you had people who were forced by the material conditions of their house to go somewhere where they knew they were at higher risk, and so often they organised to go in groups. And for me, that's the seeds of where you get kind of vigilante action, where you realise that actually collective action means that you're protected. So you walk out as a collective to go to the bath. Something as simple as bathing was kind of, you know, a risky business for people. And lots of the conversations that I had with people involved people, first of all, kind of finding that security and comfort in being in groups, and then developing that into, and I know there are people in the audience here who were involved in lots of the vigilante groups who actively kind of then patrolled the area and provided that security, because the police weren't, you know, and so they took that into their own hands. And I'm really hoping, I'm looking at particular people because I know they have direct stories to tell about those experiences. So yeah, it's all well and good me talking about them, but there are people here who lived that in this very room.
And we'll open up the discussion later so that we'll be able to share some of it. But that was the men who were able to access the public baths, be it through all of these very difficult circumstances. So what was the situation for the women when they were unable to reach those?
Yeah, so some women did go to the public baths, but again, they'd be escorted by their husbands. And other women just did stay at home. And there are people, again, who talked about baths in their interviews, because when a bath did finally arrive in their homes, that was quite a kind of big occasion. So it tells you something about the material conditions that lots of these families were living through. And also I compare that, actually, I'm just thinking back, I'll tell you the other thing, I did say to Georgie, I haven't opened the book since it got published because I'm too scared to look at it, because if I look at it I'm gonna see a mistake, so I just not looked at it. But the other thing that I remember that I do talk about in the book is that contrast of the public bath system to compare to where people had come from, and the kind of the fukuid that people would have bathed in, which would have been a space of kind of leisure and relaxation and part of the village community, and women would have bathed together, and it was a lovely experience. And I just imagine, like, when you think about going from that experience to what bathing looks like in this country, the land of gold and so on. It's such a stark contrast between those. And yeah, it's those little things, when you think about those little things, that you see kind of, gosh, what the relationship must have been like between those different spaces, and in a short migration journey for all of that to be experienced.
And did you talking about women's and men's experiences, did you interview people who were children at the time about their experiences?
I did, and I interviewed some children who were very young, who have kind of blurry memories, and then older children as well, and. Actually, lots of them are like me, of my generation, or a little bit older, where they do have some memories of it. But also lots of those children kind of have the memories which they are now revisiting. So kind of it's that whole thing of like what you remember, and then going and speaking to your parents, and then helping to kind of put some kind of detail and definition to those memories. So I did interview children, but and some of them had lots to say, others of them just had vague memories. But even those vague memories, in lots of ways, have shaped their experiences. My older sister would have been a little bit older than me, so she had vague memories of that time. And I did interview her as part of the book as well. And actually, one of the things that I remember she said, she'll be really embarrassed because I've been banging on about her today. But one of the things she talked about is the kind of home being so transient and just having to move around all the time, that was one of her kind of basic memories. It's not of kind of the different homes, but just of never being settled. And that's a big thing, and unfortunately those kind of experiences aren't 1970s. They're very real for lots of our communities now, and maybe we'll come on to that.
Thank you. So something else that really came across to me, which is so rare in many other books, not that there's anything similar to this at all, but you really write into the book the significance of the anti-colonial and liberation struggles in Bangladesh, and also the anti-racist struggles, so that all of these things were going on, and they have impacted on people's lives, on people's views of the world, depending upon what they has experienced themselves. So I just wonder about how important you felt that was to the squatter movement, sort of from the beginning.
Yeah, I think the beauty of doing oral histories is that you don't start out with a set of interview questions. You kind of say, look, this is a broad kind of time period I'm interested in. Tell me everything that you remember. So it's a really open kind of process. And some people wanted to be guided by questions, and others were very, very happy to talk at length about their experiences. And so I never really had factored in the 1971 war in terms of what I expected to come out, and that was probably in hindsight silly of me, because it was so important for so many of the participants, either because they had been there and lived through it, and when they arrived here and found themselves kind of, there's no equivalence, there's clearly no equivalence, but there's some kind of similarity between those, the kind of oppression, the racism, the kind of the denial of the right just to be yourself in 1970s Britain, but for lots of people very similar to what it was to be in East Pakistan at the time during the War of Independence. And lots of people said to me that I didn't live through that to come here and then be treated like that here. We didn't kind of stand up and fight on that scale and that level to then come here and be treated with such utter contempt. And so for lots of people, that was a really important and powerful kind of way, kind of inspiration for the response here. And we often think, when we do our histories, we often do that migration history, and we do like, they moved from there to here, and then we forget all about the there. We forget that where they came from and what they kind of carried with them. But actually, it was so important to lots of people to feel that they had gone up against kind of what seemed an impossible kind of aggressor in the War of Independence, and they'd won. And there was a fighting spirit, and I think that's again something that I really. When I was growing up, I never thought of the Bengali community as being particularly radical. I kind of saw them as being quite conservative, because my parents are like quite conservative, like small c, not big C, and they they're quite traditional, and that's that's who they are. And so I kind of have grown up with that that version of the Bengali community. But actually, that, you know, we have a radical history, and we have a radical history both back home when we were fighting for the War of Independence, but we have a radical history here. And coming back to your previous question about, like, you know, we're not allowed that, even in this period where we see lots of efforts to recover radical histories. I still think that the kind of the South Asian experience, and then the Sylheti experience and the Bengali experience in the East End, still hasn't kind of been given the credit it deserves for the fights that were fought, but which contributed to the British story. You know, I think that's the really important thing, that we forget that actually the fight for home in East London was about a migrant experience. It was about fighting racism, and it was about thinking about who had the right to claim the social resources of this country. And that's a really powerful contribution to British history, not just our history. And I think that it was important to make sure that all of that was kind of featured in the book, and that it comes from from, you know, Bangladesh plays a role in what happened here.
Definitely. And I hope for that reason that, you know, this is going to become part of the history curriculum at, you know, at school level as well as at university levels, because it really brings that across really well. So one thing that you haven't really talked about so much yet is the alliances outside of the Bengali community that existed between people who were squatting and others.
Yeah, I guess I've seen a particular person walking at the back. I won't embarrass him. I won't embarrass him. But there were lots of people who were involved in this who weren't necessarily part of the Bengali community, and who didn't have direct experience of that themselves. So they were, they were part of that wider movement. And actually, one of the things that made the Bengali squatter experience, what kind of triggered it from being lots of individual families and then kind of mobilising into a movement, was the Race Today collective. So the Race Today collective were part of the Black Power movement, and you had the likes of Darkus Howe and Farooq Dondi and Mala Sen, who were kind of Black Power activists who were thinking about the bigger picture of kind of imperialism, migration, class, and all of those things. But they kind of spied in what was happening in the East End and saw that actually this was a migrant community taking direct action, and that's what they were interested in. They were interested in supporting not kind of just theoretical journal conversations and discussions. They wanted to actually support grassroots activism. So you had kind of the Black Power Race Today, who provided kind of intellectual support. They also provided legal support. You had the Law Centre network, so you had lots of people from kind of an English middle class kind of background who came in to support and provide kind of legal support to people. And a person that I mentioned in the book, Terry Fitzpatrick, was also someone who was a squatter, who was on the ground, who was pivotal in lots of ways to both supporting individual squatters, but then kind of earning enough trust within the community to kind of help mobilise into an actual movement, to organise, and not just to kind of take the direct action and secure homes for themselves, but to then petition the council, to kind of, to organise marches and demonstrations, and to campaign for the council to do something about it as well. And Terry was really important to bringing all of those different actors together.
That's really interesting. So one of the things that I remember an early conversation when you finished your PhD and you were talking about the book, and you were saying that you were going to add 2 different chapters, one at the beginning and one at the end, because the focus of the PhD was very much on what happened in the 1970s, understandably enough. But you wanted to have kind of like a prequel and a sequel to that. I wonder if you could, I was going to ask you a little bit more about the sequel, but before moving on to that, I just wanted to get you to say a little bit about your initial chapter and why you thought that was important.
That was really important to me to do that. It didn't feature as part of the PhD. They didn't. My supervisor was like, no, Shabna, you can't extend the history timeline on this, you've got to do it on this, and so that was fair enough. But this I had a bit more control over. And so that first chapter does some of the scene setting in terms of kind of telling us how the Bengali community arrived here in the first place, and the kind of the longevity of that timeline. I think that often the narratives which try to kind of deprive us of our rights in this country are always about, they only arrived in the post-war period, or they only arrived in the 1970s, and so they therefore don't have they haven't earned their rights. And it's this idea of who can belong and who doesn't. And I was really conscious that I wanted to show that actually our relationship to this island is hundreds of years. And so the first chapter goes all the way back to Sylhet, to kind of the movement that created the movement of people that kind of we know was already there. Kind of, I think I started in the 1300s, right? Yeah. So I kind of just set the scene about kind of the Sylheti history and something about migration and mobility even then. So it's this whole idea, again, this whole idea that migration is something new and it's something to be feared. But people have been moving forever, and I wanted to kind of capture some of that in the books, which is what I did. But also to show the relationship between, again, the wealth that Britain enjoys is so kind of intimately connected to the trade and then the empire that they built. And so I highlight the direct Sylheti link between that. So I talk about this guy, Robert Balkart, who was part of the East India Company, who was stationed in Sylhet, in Sathoch, which is where my kind of family is from originally. And this guy, he earned his wealth here in Sylhet and Sathoch. But there's a castle that lives in Scotland, doesn't have any kind of name or any recognition which will say that the wealth that lives in this castle is derived from Sylhet. There's no connection, and there's no connection in our imagination either, because we kind of think that Britain's wealth belongs to Britain. It's the narrative we've been told for forever. And so that first chapter, I wanted to ensure that I set some of that scene and just showed that actually that it's nonsense to kind of describe us as just these new arrivals. The connection is a long one, and also it doesn't matter even if your connection is a short one. Everyone deserves a home, and everyone deserves a right to a dignified life. So yeah.
Yeah, I think it worked really effectively to then go from that into the great detail of the oral histories and of what happened during the 1970s. But then the sequel brings it right up to date. And I think one of the, I'll let you talk about it, but I think you find yourself interacting with some very sort of contested views about what's happening in the present.
That was the trickiest chapter for me to write, because I think I really wanted, I think you're always going to upset people with what you write. I'm quite used to offending people. Some people just find anyway, whatever. But the point is, I didn't want to not offend people. That's not what I was thinking about. But I did want to kind of be careful to the way that I represented the discussions. Because they're live and ongoing, and also the other thing that is important to me is that I'm an outsider to those discussions. I might have been born in Tower Hamlets, I might have done all of this research, but actually I don't live or work in Tower Hamlets, and so I wanted to be fair to all of the different voices and to ensure that I wasn't kind of privileging one voice over another. So I wanted to kind of show that actually there are people in the room who've talked to me about the Save Brick Lane campaign, and then there are others who were like, what do you mean Save Brick Lane? Brick Lane is always going to change. And so I wanted to reflect that diversity. And yeah, so for me that was tricky, because I didn't want anyone to feel that I had not heard or represented their voices. There were some people who I wanted to represent, who I invited to interview, who didn't kind of want to participate. So sadly their views are not represented in the book. But yeah.
And did you come across like different views depending upon people's generation, like younger people and older people? I
think there's kind of, there's a different class profile now. We've got kind of, the working class Bengali community and the kind of the middle class Bengali community. There are some people who are entrepreneurs, who are restaurateurs, who saw and see some of the changes as possibly kind of being the lifeline to their businesses and to their continued kind of survival. And then there were others who were very clear, and there was perhaps a generational, because it was a younger crowd who kind of said, no, you're mistaken, that whatever development that's going to happen is going to price you out of this area. So I think there was some generational kind of tension there in terms of views. I think there was also a class kind of tension between people who felt that their class interests might be served by these, and others who felt that no, the working class community of every colour are being kind of priced out of Brick Lane and Tower Hamlets through some of these and wider changes. So yeah, I wanted to make sure that I represented those fairly.
So just kind of like a final point then, before we open up discussion and people to share some of their comments as well, is really just about the different impacts that squatting might have had on people's later lives. Is that something that emerged through the interviews?
Yeah, it was really clear that some people went on to have quite active political careers, actually, who went on to become, there were 3 of the first Bengali councillors in Tower Hamlets in the 1980s were from the squatter community. So they had been involved in the Bengali Housing Action Group, and they went on to kind of seek and secure election as local councillors. So it's really clear that there are some people who did go on to make kind of political careers based on their activism. And that was clearly something that I wanted to feature and kind of have as part of my book. But I was also really interested in fathers of people sitting here who never had that profile, who just went on to live their lives in their ordinary way, to kind of look after their families and do the best they could for their family here and their family back home. And for me, there was a real kind of effort to find the people who didn't have that public profile, because again, it's those stories that are often deemed uninteresting and unimportant. And for me, they are the backbone of building any community. When you are doing that, when you are lending your support, when you put your kind of self at risk in order to support other people, that work is, that's the contribution that people made that I wanted to kind of highlight in the book. And so it was just as important to me to feature their stories as it was the people who have gone on to kind of build political careers and continue to kind of work for the Bengali community and wider through the kind of work in politics and so on.
So when you were saying that, I was really thinking about the work of Caroline Adams. I don't know if many people here read her collection of oral histories of South Asian, particularly Sylheti seafarers. So when I first came to work in Tower Hamlets in the 1980s, it was just before her book was published, Across 7 Seas and 13 Rivers. And she did that, as many of us know, as a community worker. She was outside of the university, and she saw that it was so important to record the voices of the men, some of whom were born in the early 20th century, about their experience in ships in the days of empire, as well as during and up to the Second World War. And when I remember having conversations with her, and when she finished writing, was publishing the book, she always wanted it to be those men's voices that were coming across, to be really situated in their lives, and was really hoping that, you know, afterwards we would have many more opportunities to hear the voices of Bangladeshi people written by Bangladeshi people. And your work, which is, what's this now, 40 years after that came out, does that so strongly and so powerfully. And the way that it captures those voices of women and men, people who experienced all of the struggles that you've kind of intimated. I haven't gone into a lot of detail. Is just very, very powerful. So, you know, congratulations for the book. It's fantastic that it's come out, and really look forward to the, I don't know, what is it, second reprint, third reprint, etc. But I'd just like to, well, round of applause for Shabna. We're going to open to questions and comments now, if that's okay by you. Yeah. So, okay, and if you could just say, introduce yourself when you ask the question as well. Thank you.
So my name is Georgie, and I'm from the University of Organised. So I wanted to know about the ethical dilemmas that you faced while doing your oral history interviews, in terms of you being a native kind of historian working among your own community. So what kind of challenges you face when you're interviewing your own kin members, your own family members, or let's say community whom you have grown up, as you said, the kind of contested political terrain in which you're working. So you can kind of
Yeah, that's a good question. I guess my first thought is that being from the community, obviously the community is a big one, diverse, and then you're never going to kind of be identical to the person that you're interviewing. But for me, that was the biggest advantage. It was that there were lots of people who said to me, do you know what, I've spoken to so many researchers, don't want to do it anymore, but you're Nijar Manush, and so so I will give you an interview because you're one of us. And so I think that the ethical dilemma that was involved there was to honour that story, therefore, to kind of ensure that actually I was honest to that person and what they'd said, and that I was able to represent what they'd told me in a way that didn't kind of have to fit, like I said, this impulse to do tidy narratives and neat kind of stories. So that I wanted to ensure that I was honest with the stories and careful with the stories that people told me and what I shared of those stories. So that was it was not my dilemma, it was just my ethical responsibility to make sure that I was treated as someone who they considered their own, and so that gave me a responsibility, an additional responsibility to ensure that I was kind of respectful of their stories.
And I saw that some people were very happy to have their names included, whereas there were some other people who remained anonymous.
Again, that's fair, and I think that it's a shame because my parents didn't get that opportunity. They kind of, they were part of the story, so they didn't get an opportunity to be anonymised in it. I wanted to make sure that people felt that they could share their story without being obliged to have to kind of be in it. And I think it's probably also important to say that it's a really hard story. There were some really, really hard stories, and there are people in this room who made me cry with their stories. And you take a lot from people when you ask them to revisit a period of their life that was that hard. There are stories that people told me in this room that I went home to relate to my siblings, and we all kind of were really shocked by it. So I think that, coming back to your question, oral history gives you such a big responsibility to be so careful with someone's story and to be respectful of it. My ambition, and it'll take me a really long time to get there, is that all of those oral histories will be archived. So while I've got the kind of extracts of it here in my book, the ambition is for it to be archived so that actually other researchers can go back and listen to the audio and see the transcript, so that actually other people can take from it from what they want. And that's the beauty of oral histories, is that most of those people gave obviously their permission for that to happen.
And were you filming as well? Did you make a
No,
film?
I did, yeah. That's a long old drama,
Okay,
Georgie.
okay. That one now. Yeah, another question.
I just want to follow up on, because I made a note of it earlier on when you were talking about histories and stuff. The oral history thing is so important. My mother is now 93 years old. She is not long for this world. The stories she can tell are so important, and I would encourage everybody in the room, get a cassette tape, get a mini disc recorder or anything, and record those things. The British, and you talking about archiving, the British Library have a really brilliant sound archive. Send them and make it part of that oral history, so that researchers in the future can come across those things and be part of something.
Yeah, and it's a really important point, that, because I took what I got from those interviews, but there's so much, like I said, some of those interviews are, hundreds of hours of interviews that are in no way given justice either in the PhD or just that book. And so there's so much more in those oral histories that other people who are listening to it will take from it as well. So yeah, it's a good shout.
Thank you. Yes, Nadia.
I had a weird question, so I'm going to find with you too. And I found every time I tried to ask my nanny about her life, and she's had a wall. And I feel like the women of our culture were very stern and we don't tend to open up. So how did you find how did you figure out the most sensitive way to kind of broach these subjects? Because it's a traumatic history, and I see why we're very reluctant to share it. But I hear you when you say that you want it to be written and you want something for our future generation to look back on. And I don't want those histories to ever be lost. But every time I try to open that door, it closes it so quick. So I've never quite figured out the best way to broach it and kind of get us to be enough of it and talk through those traumatic things.
Yeah, I think that's tricky, right? Because everyone's entitled to their privacy, and everyone's entitled to kind of be able to decide what they do and don't share. And there may well be other people in this room who have kind of a good answer to that. But I think that when I spoke to my parents, I think that I think I'd just done it for so long and asked them for so many times that, like, you know, it was through successive kind of and just keeping on going. But it was also about kind of making a bit of time. So when I did do the actual proper oral histories, it was about kind of just making it a little bit formal, like, you know, this is the tape, I am going to ask you these questions. And there was something a little bit kind of special about doing it that time, even though I'd heard most of the stories that they told me in those interviews. So it was about parking out the time, but I do get it. It's a hard thing, right? And for lots of people, there's a huge amount of pain and trauma in that. But I also think that there was something, and is still something, for lots of people about shame as well, that it was a hard time. It's not something that particularly people want to talk about, because actually we're not there now. We live a totally different life, and look at us, we've got our nice homes now, and, you know, we're so past that. And so maybe there's something of like a sense of kind of embarrassment about going back to that as well. And I think that I hope this book is part of kind of saying there's nothing embarrassing or shameful about that, and actually that history is so much a part of why I live my middle class life and have my PhD now, is because actually my parents gave me the opportunities through the fights that they fought. And so I think it's really important to kind of perhaps open or pester those conversations with the fact that actually it's such a special thing that people did, and what you did, it's really important what you did. And again, whether that comes from a personal sense, but also the world has told us our stories aren't kind of important. The world has thus far said, oh, what you did, you know, it's a story about deprivation, but it's so much more than that. So I think lots of different angles, I don't know, but yeah.
There's a few questions. I'm just going to go in order that I've seen them. So 1, 2, 3, 4 at the moment. Naz first.
Thank you. It's really, really awesome in terms of some of the things that you said. Just going on from what you said in terms of our oral history, in terms of what our parents think. It's amazing, because when I speak to my mum in terms of how I'm a child of the 70s, you know, I grew up, and when you said about Stepney could be different for us, these two guys are the two founders of some of the fantastic work that's achieved in Spitalfields in terms of recording some of the things that we do. But for me, in terms of what you're doing now, amazing. And the fact that we need to say to people, my generation and I'm old, and others, we need to recall, whether it's writing it down or an oral history in terms of what you think and what you say, invaluable. Our contribution to town hamlets, both before and now, invaluable in terms of what our parents. And I remember, you said Terry earlier on, and I remember Terry helped my old man, and not just Terry.
Yeah.
These are the people that are the very people in our communities, not just 1, 2, helped huge amounts of people in terms of how they integrated. And they did it not because they wanted anything for one of them. They did it because they could. They did it because it was the right thing to do. And those, for me, are the most important things that we need to take away, that people at that generation, people from our community, and not just our Bangladeshi Muslim community, Terry is not a Muslim name. You know, kind of thing. There were people in British white communities that made sure they made us feel welcome. That made sure they said, well, you know, we came from the Commonwealth and this was our home, that said, welcome, kind of thing. And for me, those are the lessons that we need to make sure that are recorded. Those are the lessons that we need to make sure our children celebrate and say, well, how do we make sure things get better? So, seriously, well done.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. Amadullah, you're next.
I just want to share something. For a different project, we interviewed a woman. She is actually dies subsequently. But her daughter told us that, this project had immortalized my mom. And she didn't know many things about her mom before she gave us the interview. Right? And just to add to that lady over there, I think sometimes parents are the one tell too much, to their children. It's sometimes it can be embarrassing, or there's some psychological reluctance. So someone else might be able to do it more in-depth interviews of older people than their own children.
Yeah, I think that's true. I think it's sometimes easier if it's not someone who's directly connected to you, but we're greedy to hear it ourselves as well, right? So yeah.
There's Bangladeshi people in our communities that are growing up not learning how to speak Bengali. There was an article in The Guardian a couple of years ago about a Bangladeshi girl who grew up in Stepney. I'm going back home to live with my mum. I need to relearn Sylhet. And we grew up together. It's not. I grew up with my siblings speaking Bengali. The only time I spoke Bengali was with my mum and dad, kind of thing. So that was that's what it was, kind of thing. So for us now to turn around and say, how do we make sure we keep that resemblance of who we are, what we are? People like you and others fundamentally important on that. So it's good.
Thank you. Oh, no, I just want to echo what Nas said. So there has been other amazing stories as well. I was going to comment. Shadinota Trust, they commissioned a book called Tales of Three Generation, and that also captures like inter kind of ethnic tension as well with the Pakistani community in the 1971 war. But my kind of comment is, again, these great stories, you want to kind of like people to be aware of it, because all these books become history as well. Like people don't really know much about it or don't even know it exists. So maybe kind of promote it to your networks and make sure that it doesn't get lost.
Yeah, I think that's part of I feel like that's you guys' responsibility. I'm not going to do self-promotion, but I think this is the book is out there, and it's about us kind of sharing that history and making sure that it does go beyond kind of just this community. And it's really important for me to be here in a public library in Tower Hamlets, because I think it's about where these stories get told, and that's why it's so important not to just have it live as a PhD. Who's going to hear it? Where there are no important ears, as far as I'm concerned, that are going to be hearing it there. So it's all well and good us kind of doing that, but like you say, it's about kind of making sure that actually the history is shared beyond the book, and actually kind of the generations we've got, the young generation here, and people who are to kind of hear and take that on as well.
I feel like I should be responding really, because Shabna's the worst person at promoting herself. so yeah, I mean, it's all of our responsibility to be promoting these the book and the stories that are in it. So yeah, thank you. Yeah, there's a question behind.
I know, I'm Shabna, I think we need to recognize your dad. So if you could maybe kindly stand up and see him. It's amazing, man. Thank you.
just the royal wave. That's what you're going to get.
Did you want to say anything? No, okay, fine. Did you want to say anything else?
Big credit to your dad for making who you are, maybe. It's amazing. I was actually born in Sylhet, in the Fortic, in Lautalagram, in Jagannathpur. Came to the UK when I was about 20 months old, to Ocean Estate. Then we moved to Bow, E3, very racist area. I remember after moving out there, about a couple of years after moving out into Bow, few families, they squatted, and big fights and big, they were fortunate, because the amount of racism that we faced in Bow was really intense. My primary life in Bow was really a traumatic experience, being chased by gangs. It was not a nice experience. And so big thank you to you for writing this book from a Sylheti kind of point of view and perspective. I think oral history is very, very powerful. My grandma, who wasn't school educated, but she was very knowledgeable, like a historian, and she used to like talking, so I'm quite fortunate as compared to you. And I used to sit down with her when I went 1986 back to Bangladesh, and then 1994 when I came the second time, and I was really having conversations with her. And then I kind of established, we were actually from Satlok, from Tenrakilla, and it's all through this oral kind of conversation. And then my forefathers, they came from Satlok, they then migrated to Jagannathpur and which village in Jogannapur she actually knew. And then the last time I went to Bangladesh, 2017, my wife is beside me. 2017, then I was very fortunate to have my aunts still alive. And then I was again speaking to her, and then she actually said to me, because my grandfather, he passed away in World War II, he was a sea merchant. And so she used to get, my grandma used to get some sort of pension money, or war widows pension money or something. And they had to connect it from Shunam Point. So when my grandma used to take my dad and my aunt, she used to actually point out the exact village that we were from, Tengatinda. And the sad thing is, a lot of these conversation I could have recorded, but I didn't record. And one of my greatest regret, in fact, one of my biggest regret is she actually knew my family tree all the way back about 11 generations out. And when I was in Bangladesh in 1992, 93, I think, so I learned the family tree. I actually memorized it. And then she kept on telling me, are you writing it down? Are you writing it down? And just to get her off my back, I was like a teenager, I said, yeah, I've written it down. I've got it memorized, so why do I need to write it down? So one of my biggest regret. The question I would have to ask you is obviously I haven't read the book, but I'll be very eager to read your book, all of it, A to Z. And you mentioned about the colonial kind of aspect of it. Being born in Britain, and when you speak about colonial atrocities or some of the issues that we had as a British Empire, do you get the judgment from people where sometimes people can perceive you to be anti-British? Because I sometimes have conversations when we kind of talk about the historical point of view or aspects of the empire. Sometimes, unfortunately, people they start judging me like thinking you are anti-British or something, and we are absolutely not. So do you get sometimes people making comments or and finally, what's their next book?
Just on your first point about your regret, you do keep some of your grandma's, your nanny's memory, right? You've got some that, even if it's not written down, you've got something. You maybe write down whatever you do remember. I think it's not lost now. And I remember I did the same. We've got something of a version of it in our family where when I went back home, we managed, and it's amazing how much my nanny knew and my daddy knew about their family history and how many generations they could go back in terms of the name. And I did write down, well, I don't know where that piece of paper is right now, but anyway, that's another story. But yeah, so it's worth probably kind of writing down what you do remember. But I think I'm really lucky. The micro environment and the micro community I'm in, I work with lovely people. I have a lovely family and friends where actually that kind of judgment that you described isn't one that I've had direct experience of. So I've not had anyone who's kind of said, where are you going with this? But I know the narrative. The narrative is a common one, right? That kind of all of our efforts to write ourselves into the history, there's a lot of challenge to that. But actually that's not being anti-British. There's nothing about being anti-British about writing ourselves into British history. It's been erased, it's been ignored, and that is a correction of British history, not anti-British at all. So I know exactly what I would say if I was involved in that conversation, and yeah, luckily I've not been in it, but yeah, bring it on if they were to. So yeah, I'd be quite happy to have that conversation with anyone if they wanted it.
Thank you so much.
You've been teaching politics.
Yeah.
Yeah, so 1, 2, yeah. Okay, first question.
Thank you for writing this book. I've grown up at home listening to stories from my uncle, and I always said that it's going to be stories will be lost unless someone writes about them. And I guess now it's been passed on to the next generation. You've mentioned a few things like housing is still the biggest crisis in this country. Racism still exists, it's just been institutionalized now. However, we have an Indian PM, Prime Minister, we have a Pakistani London Mayor, we have a Pakistani First Minister from Scotland. I was just wondering, sort of from your stories, do our younger generation have any regrets, or would they do anything differently? Because we are still, sort of the Bengalis have a long way to go, still I'd say, although we're doing well. and what would be your
Yeah, I think that's a really tricky question. First of all, I think there's a totally different class background to all of the people that you mentioned, right? Kind of the success story that's touted about those particular individuals and the positions they're in tell us something about the class profile of Britain more than it does about kind of race and racism. I'm going to point to my boss Halima sitting in the front row, who is the CEO of the Runnymede Trust. And the idea that, and actually there's so many other people in this room that I could point to as well, who are, you know, hugely successful, influential people from the British Bangladeshi community. And I think that, yes, obviously I think our educational attainment levels in Tower Hamlets have kind of been hugely improved in recent decades. But institutional racism still exists, and the intersection of class and race are one of the biggest barriers to the Bengali community. So, I think that we shouldn't take it as a Bengali community who haven't done as well. It's the systems and the structures of this country still are kind of stacked up against us. So despite our educational progress, we know that kind of in terms of our labour market profile, that's not reflected there. And that's not because we're not as qualified. We are as qualified as our counterparts from all of those different communities. We need more people like Halima and other people who are in this room who are doing the work to kind of challenge the systemic racism that's holding us back. It's not a deficiency of the Bangladeshi community. It's definitely one where we need to think about how we activate our political power to make sure that we are seeing the kind of gains that we really do deserve. So, yeah.
Yeah, thank you. Sorry, there was a question there first, yeah.
Just a quick question. During the squattling in the 1970s, why did the other surrounding boroughs come in and help, saying, you know, we can find you some space? Why didn't other councils come and help?
Yeah, well, there was the structure of the housing system was kind of two-tiered. So you had the Tower Hamlets Council, but you also had the GLC. But also you had a community that wanted to stay in this quite specific area for all of the reasons that have been outlined in terms of kind of the National Front violence. We're talking about real, brutal, regular, randomised violence that was visited on people. So the security that came from being as part of quite a close kind of geographic community was one of the things that made this particular area, the Spitalfields Brick Lane area, such an appealing place for the Bengali community to be. So for lots of people, some people were actually offered housing, but often in parts of the borough like Bow and Poplar. Terry says, Poplar was like a swear word back in the 1970s, because the idea that you might be moved to Poplar was kind of horrifying, because you would be isolated, you would be the victim of racist violence from your neighbours, from the estate, and so people wanted to stay. So I think that's the other part of the direct action, is that people refused to be moved out from spaces that they had made their community. And I guess that's what I pick up in the last chapter as well, is that some of that kind of institutional state kind of violence to dispersed communities was resisted in the 1970s, but we face that in a very different way now as a Bengali, but as a working class community as well. That those pressures may be different, but they're still very much there.
So there was a need for group protection.
Yeah, there was, and lots of people didn't know. So I was born in during this time in Tower Hamlets, but my parents moved out, so we never came back to Tower Hamlets. We ended up kind of moving around, as I said, but then ended up living in South East London and then in Hackney. But lots of people stayed, and they stayed because of that security of the community that they'd built up, that they'd invested in, that people who are sitting here made sure that they actually put their lives on the line to kind of to protect.
You had another question.
No, I was just going to say, I appreciate what you said about the racism and structural racism, but I think there is another perspective. I think we've moved on quite positively since the 70s and the 80s. Like, I was a college dropout, and I'm really grateful for being in this country, for giving me that opportunity to get where I am. And in my own experience as just a male Bengali Sylheti growing up in the Ocean Estate, sometimes we let ourselves down. It's not always racism. Sometimes Bengali boys you know, they're the worst enemies sometimes. You know, they didn't make that effort. They made bad choices, and I think it's just worth, you know.
But then that's what I come back to, is that I don't want to kind of be rose tinted and kind of like we're all perfect. Of course there are issues and problems, but that's within any community. That's within any community. Absolutely. And so I think that to kind of imagine that it is our singular as part of the character of the Bengali community, it isn't the case. And actually some of the reasons for why people end up in positions where they might drop out, where they don't go on to get the kind of jobs or kind of security that they want, are not always in their control as well. And so, you know, I'm not trying to kind of take away personal responsibility. Of course there is personal responsibility in the choices that we have and that we make, but at the same time there are some people who do what you described and will still go on to be Prime Minister of a country. That's not saying.
Thanks. You had a question, another question.
It's a reflection and a point and a question, and they make some questions. I've lived around the East End since 1984. I first visited here up in 1978, 79. I was living in Bow, but knew was the vice chair of the Ocean Tennis Association, the vice chair of the Tennis Association. He would phone me up and say, "Can you spend the night here in this flat?" And he and I used to turn up and sit in the living room of a flat while racist youths and yobs used to be stood outside. And we sat there trying to comfort this woman and going, if it comes to it, we will get in the fight. We are there. You've called the Tennis Association and we will support. And that racism was, at the time, the world has got better, but at the time, late 70s, early 80s, it was just horrific. And thankfully the world has moved on. Coming back, sorry, that was just a comment there. Can I go back to what you said? You said you thought there might be a correction to British history, or you might suggest corrections to British history.
That's probably endless.
Or was that you? Sorry. And I'm thinking that there possibly should be a correction to world history, because actually, we're all migrants. Absolutely, and we should shout that loudly from rooftops. We are all, every single one of us on this planet is a migrant. We walked out of Africa and we have populated the world. That is what humanity did. We have migrated. People have always migrated, and we need to say that much more loudly, much more clearly than, and not having a go at you, I'm just...
I think that, it's a really fair point. You're absolutely right about it. And just on that, I would also say that, so apart from being a politics teacher, I also used to be a Key Stage 3 history teacher, and as part of that, I used to teach like the 1066 story, and when we talk about 1066 and kind of William the Conqueror and the Battle of Hastings, why do we not talk about migration and mobility there, right? We always refer it to as this big moment in our history, but we're talking about migration and mobility there. So all the way through British history, we are actually talking about migration and mobility, but often not really talking about it in those terms. Yes. And therefore you kind of disguise the fact that, like you say, our whole human history is one of movement. We've never been settled in one place and just stayed there. That's the way it is.
Thank you. Did you have a question?
Yeah, possibly a question and a comment, which is to maybe just go back to the point around the importance of that book and actually resurrecting the history of the struggles and the Bengali working class Sylheti voice. When we think about the East End, there are a couple of history points that we all know, right? Whether they know it outside London, I don't know. But there's Cable Street, there's the match strike, right?
Yeah,
actually, this is the history that needs to go into the curriculum, so then it becomes the British history. The reason why I think your book is so powerful, and it's not just because I know you, the reason why it's so powerful is because you get the best history, the best lived experience, the best books from the people that experience that change. And actually we had to wait 40 years since Caroline Adams' book to see this book. This is more than a book. This is actually about us saying, this is our voice, our history, we're articulating in our own terms, and this is what the rest of the country will learn about. It's so phenomenal, and this is why I think it's more than a book. It's actually giving voice and power to the stories of British Bangladeshis at a time when we were so fragile. And yes, we had more in common with Race Today Collective and others, but a lot of people have heard about Race Today Collective, but they haven't heard of the Bengali names. How many of us know those pictures and photographs where there are these Bengali men on the front line? Everybody knows Mala Sen's name, but give me the names of those other men that are in those pictures. We never gave them a name. And your book does that. It is so phenomenal, and I'm just so overwhelmed that it got done. But boy, 40 years. I can't wait to see the next one.
Yeah, well, you're going to might have to wait another 40 years for that and someone else. But Halima, I've got to say, again, I started with saying that you know, it's all very much, you know, this whole book writing thing is an individual thing, right? But it's not, because you were there as part of that journey. You put me in touch with so many people. There were so many conversations that you allowed me to go and collect as part of this. And so I come back to that it is kind of one person's name on one book, but there's a shared responsibility and there's been a shared contribution to achieving this in the first place. And it's really important that we do kind of take that responsibility and kind of think about how, not just promoting this book, but let's not wait another 40 years. Who's sitting in this room thinking about doing something, about recording something and finding a way to share it? And like I said, I never intended to do the PhD, but it just became the only way to do it. So it's kind of, it's taking a chance on something that was just felt like quite a whimsical idea, and it's led kind of, you know, took a few years and a few more grey hairs earned through it, but it's so gratifying to hear people talk about it in the way, because apart from anything else, Caroline Adams' book is like phenomenal. That is like one of the best accounts, and just for my book to be even spoken about in the same breath as hers, because you're right, it's such an important contribution to archiving our history. And actually what Caroline Adams does, and Georgie, which you've done, is you have really always tried to make sure that you open the door and allow others in, like me, because actually you've been very mindful of your positionality to the community and the affection and the relationship you obviously have with it in more ways than I do. But also of making sure that the voices are, that different voices are encouraged, and you encouraged me to be part of it as well. So there are so many people in this room who either shared or indirectly shared their kind of their efforts in this book. But yeah, if it's phenomenal, it's because of all of that.
And you put in so much work. You put in so much work. We're going to begin to wrap up so that Shabna can sign some books and you can like chat to her a little bit one-to-one. But there were a couple of questions at the back. I think one was Danielle and one gentleman here. So if you could just both say your questions and then Shabna can...
So moved on, but I mean, we were talking about families wanting to be in this area. There was a whole question of unity, so we probably looked at the report done in 1981 from Deborah Phillips at GFC.
Yeah, I did, yeah.
Who was talking about the fact that nobody wanted to go to Portugal, etc. The amenities were there, but no one thought it was safe here. But also that, as a result, the housing in the Iran area was much poorer because it was predominantly living like The second thought was that William the Conqueror received wisdom as his French, it's not French, it's French. The language of the country, it's called Normandy, and the language of Norway, which is like Danish, but Norwegian Danish. So,
yeah, migration and mobility, all there represented in that final comment.
Thanks. And then one final point.
Just to follow that up, slight encouragement. My son at St Paul's Way School, GCSE big history theme is migration, beginning with the Vikings, which is encouraging.
And they recognise
because you and many of your interviews are done in Sylhet rather than English.
Yeah.
Do you think that meant that anything's been lost in translation? And would you do a Sylhet translation of the book?
Oh, do you know what? Yeah, I've been asked that question. It's a really good question. So yeah, I did lots of the interviews in Sylhet. My Sylhet is not great, and so yeah, so that was tricky. But I got better by the end of the time I was doing it. I was much better. And yes, you always lose in translation. You know, Sylhet as a language has so much nuance. There's lots of comedy in our language that you can't just translate across into English. So yes, you do lose something of that, but clearly that was for the purpose of this was to kind of make it accessible to that wider audience. There's been lots of talk about translating it into Bengali and then also getting it published in Bangladesh, because you know, who else needs to know about this story is the people who stayed, you know, the people who stayed and who were kind of an invisible part almost of the migration story. So there is talk of it. Costs a lot of money apparently to do that, and my publishers are lovely, but they are a small independent radical publisher, and that's a big burden for them. So there's conversations about it, but yeah, we'll see.
So
Okay, final.
I just learned that Bob over there, he speaks perfect Sylhet, so I'm just offering to help.
Thank you. Well, thank you very much, Shabna, for sharing all of your work, all of your insights, all of your knowledge. Thank you so much for sharing it with us, and thank you everybody for coming on such a hot evening. And we're going to be around for about another half an hour, 20 minutes, half an hour. I think, Shabna, maybe if you sit here, we'll bring the books over here. Yeah. If anybody wants to come and chat or buy a book or a signed copy, I think they're reduced from £16 to £12.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you for coming.
Yeah, can I just say, Georgie, thank you so much. You made this lovely. I always describe myself as a backstage person. I'm much happier sitting at a desk and behind the scenes. But Georgie, you made this lovely. And Hamidullah and Brick Lane Circle, thank you for, I asked you to organise it and then it was organised within seconds. So thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.